Amen. All right, so the great woman of Shunem, we are going to just jump right in. I don't have a funny story or a weird dream for you tonight. I'm so sorry. But I wanted to jump right in because, oh my word, and I don't know if you think I say this every time, but there's a lot to cover in this woman's story. So her story is found in 2 Kings chapter 4, and we're going to start in verse 8. Now, again, I'm not going to read her whole story because it would take up my whole devotion. So you guys have the book. You guys can go back and read over some of the verses. If I skip over a verse, I really did it on purpose, just because I know you guys can go back and study it again. So I won't cover every verse in here. There's a lot. But let's start in verse 8, where she is first mentioned. And it fell on a day that Elijah passed to Shunem, where there was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread. And so it was that as oft as he passed by, he turned in thither to eat bread. So this woman is not named. She is just called a great woman. And this is going to be the opposite of what we looked at a long time ago when we talked about Athaliah. I don't know how many of you guys remember that lesson, but she was what? A wicked woman, right? The opposite of what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, when you look up great in a dictionary, you get rich, generous, dignified, noble are some of the terms that define it. And again, I said we don't know her name, so a lot of people will call her the Shunammite woman. And it's interesting, though, that such a woman of high rank, because that's what a great woman would mean, is unnamed. But I do believe it's because her name isn't as important as her story. But at the same time, for God to put her in here as a great woman is like, wow, right? Like, I want to be called a great woman for God. I want to being called great by God is a wonderful thing. Now, it can mean that she is wealthy of material wealth, that she was a prominent woman. But there's going to be something we're going to learn more importantly about her life, and that she was rich in faith towards God. And it's one thing to have, wealth or maybe material things in this life, and we're going to learn about her home and stuff like that later, but are we rich towards God? As we study her, we're going to see that she illustrates several qualities of what it means to be a great woman of God. And as I've been digging deeper in her story, even though I've been familiar with this story for many years and heard it taught and preached, as I dug deeper, I just thought, oh man, this is what the woman I want to be. We're going to see that she was a woman of faith. She was a woman of discernment, a hospitable woman. She was a giving woman, and a woman of wisdom and courage. And I could literally take each of those points and just break them. I could probably teach like 7, different devotions based on just this woman, but I don't have the time, so we're going to have to condense it all. So I do have points that all start with the letter P, so that'll help as well. So we're just going to try to dissect her life pretty quickly here. So I want to go over the background. So this part of Israel's history, like we've learned in a lot of stories, is a dark time. It's a time of apostasy, right? It's a season of terrible apostasy in the land of Israel. There's backsliding, there's idol worship, there's pagan practices, and ultimately the nation is going to go into captivity and God is going to judge them, but he warns them, and how he warns them is through prophets. So God in his mercy sends prophets to warn the people that are falling away, and he pleads with them to return to him. And among those prophets are 2 men, Elijah, and then his successor after him is Elisha. So the town that we're in is the town of Shunem. Shunem is a village in the tribe of Issachar, and which is in the northern part of the nation of Israel. It's a few miles north of a city called Jezreel, which if you read, you'll read a lot of stories in the Bible of that place, and you can read about those stories later. But it's on a main trade route from Samaria to Mount Carmel, which was a route that Elijah traveled frequently. So this town was en route, and as a Shunammite woman and her husband probably looked out the window, they could see him traveling. And it says in verse 8 that she constrained him to come into their house and eat with them. So the first thing you see is that she wants him to come into her house. the preacher. She sees that he might be hungry. And then in verse 9, let's read that. And she said unto her husband, Behold now, I perceive that this is an holy man of God, which passeth by us continually. So in verse 9, it says that she says to her husband, I perceive that this is a man of God. So the first point is her perception. To perceive is defined as known by the senses, felt, understood, and observed. It's really the way we see things. And I read this in the girls' Bible book recently to them, and it says, God sees things as they truly are and not as they appear. God says, the way I see things is different from the way you see things, but I am right. And there are two types of people on this planet. There are those who see things the way they really are and respond properly, and there are those who see things the way they think they are, and it takes a lifetime to figure out they were wrong. The first group learns by seeking godly wisdom. The second group learns by making mistakes. For the Christian, wisdom of God is the winning element in life, and it is right there for the taking. It is to be understood and applied. It holds the answers to a successful life. When God gives you wisdom, he also gives you perception, so you can see things from God's vantage point and not your own. Now, what I see in this woman is she saw Elisha, and she knew who he was. He was the man of God. She knew he was a man of God. She knew the work he was doing, and she knew he's the real deal, right? This is an important thing to observe in this woman's life because so many women are led astray by false preachers, by false doctrines, and then they lead their husband and their children with them. There are too many different voices out in the world today. There's a lot of YouTube preachers, and what they do is they take the place of the real men of God that God has put there. And so I want to ask you, would you be able to say, I perceive that this is a man of God? Can you perceive who the man of God is? Can you discern his message? Do you know how to perceive the people around you and which ones are walking the path of Christ and which ones are going to lead you astray? Now, I always love to put the virtuous woman in, so she's going to be in here in a couple parts. So in Proverbs 31:18, I love this verse. It says, she perceiveth that her merchandise is good. The virtuous woman is keenly aware of the state of affairs going on around her. She stands back and observes. Her merchandise are the people in her home that the Lord has given her to minister to. It says that her merchandise is good, which means she regularly takes inventory to see if there is any lack, and she is a wise woman who asks the Lord to see things through his eyes, which is true perception. We have learned about the virtuous woman's heart, and that it's and how she is in her home, and how she loves her husband and she takes care of his heart. We learned that last time, versus the opposite of Athaliah and what she did with her husband. And but now we're seeing that her head is there, right? Perception. Her head is there. She is perceptive to what is going on in her home and the people in her home. She can tell when the people in her home might need a piece of bread, right? Like the great woman. She can tell in her home when they might need some encouragement. She can tell when her kids maybe need extra attention and love, or maybe just training and discipline. And she does not ignore the people around her. She's in tune to their needs. She sees the sad and tired and lonely faces. She sees maybe the attitude and rebellion. She sees the spiritual struggles in those around her, and she sees more need of prayer for her loved ones. So, how are you doing today in this area of perception? Are you getting a little lax and overseeing the merchandise that is placed in your care by the Lord? I don't think it was a coincidence that Elisha kept going by her home. I think the Lord knew that she would perceive and know that this man of God needed rest. This man of God needed a meal. And so can you be, can the Lord know that you're going to be a good steward of the people he has placed in your life? Or has your heart not really been in your home? And what do you see when you look at those around you? Elijah never had to tell her that he was tired or needed a meal. She just perceived that. She saw it. And you know, Elijah was getting older, and maybe the journey was taking long, and he was getting slower. Maybe she saw that. Maybe she saw the things because she was perceptive to the needs around her. And just like Jesus, in Matthew 9:36 it says, "But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd." Now, the great woman of Shunem was generous with what she had, we saw, because as soon as she saw the preacher, she invited him in and shared food with him. She opened her home for meals. And I bet you she had a very warm home full of love and welcome. But we can just imagine that as time went on and they got to know the prophet, she thought, I'd like to do something more. So go to verse 10 in 2 Kings 4, and it says, "Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on the wall, and let us set for him there a bed and a table and a stool and a candlestick. And it shall be when he cometh to us that he shall turn in hither." So her and her husband start a renovation project, right? They build a little chamber for the man of God. It'll be his own room where he can come and rest during his travels. Maybe he didn't have a place to rest in between the two places he was going. And she also, though, didn't just put in a bed. She put in careful detail. Like if you guys go to a hotel, don't you love it when there's really a lot of nice details put in? You know, it's really hard when there's a stiff bed and a really old, a really old blanket on there, and it smells, you know, and you want it to be like a home away from home when you go out of town and when you're traveling. And I think that's what this woman did for Elijah. She remodeled her home, like literally took her home and said, I'm going to add space, not for, you know, another room for my she shed, or what are those called for women? Yeah. Or my man cave, you know, my husband needs a man cave, or this will be our TV room. She said, I'm going to build a room, and it's going to be for God, and it's going to be used for God, and it's going to be for the man of God. She sacrificed her own space and comfort for the ministry. How many of us would do that? How would you treat the man of God who is weary from the ministry? So we already see so much in just 3 verses. We see she has a heart of kindness and compassion and generosity. We see that she was not self-centered, right? She was, and she was also very alert and attentive, perceptive to the needs of others. She provides him food first and then shelter. And, you know, for a preacher, maybe it was a time for him where he could rest, where he could pray, where he could hear from God. And Matthew 10:41 says, "He that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man reward." So I wanted to talk to you about hospitality and go over a couple things about hospitality. When we open our homes for meals, when we host people overnight, which we do a lot of, and I'm going to tell some stories in a minute, really what you're doing is you're trying to become a reflection of God, right? Who he is, what God is like. It's a ministry. It's called the ministry of hospitality. And it's given to us all, and it's a way to reflect the heart of God to others. It is very much lacking, though, in our society, where we all just kind of are in, you know, dwell in our little homes, and we think we're socializing and helping people, but really we're not having any face-to-face. We're not inviting people into our home, and we're not being hospitable, and it's lacking in our society today. And it's not happening anymore. But it really is the way God wants us to minister to each other. And hospitality is just opening your heart and your home. It's being generous with what you have. It's saying, I've been a recipient of God's grace. I've been blessed, and here I want to share it with you. And so some things hospitality does. It builds unity. The Bible promises rewards for those who practice hospitality. It witnesses to non-believers. You know, it's a great way. When we first moved into our house in Colorado, in Aurora, the first thing we did was invite all our neighbors over for dinner. And I didn't know them from Adam, you know? So I was very nervous about what to cook, and I didn't know them, and I knew they weren't saved, but it was a way to start witnessing to our neighbors. We didn't have a church to do that in, so we literally started knocking doors on our own street and then just inviting people over for dinner. And it's really a way for you to have non-believers into your home. We'll talk about that later too, but you got to be careful with that. But and share a meal with them, and, you know, give them the gospel, talk to them about the Lord. There's something about what the Bible talks about breaking bread, right? Breaking bread. That's why we love to take people out to lunch after Sunday. It's really a way to get to know somebody when you eat with them. It helps us deal with loneliness. Hospitality helps us deal with selfishness. It helps us deal with materialism, because then it really just gets our view on eternal things. I can't tell you how many things have broken having people over, but I remember a friend of mine, her son had this wagon, and it was his prized wagon, and they had a family over, and that kid broke his wagon, and she was like, should I ask him to pay for it? And I was like, no, you don't ask him to. You invited them over. If things get broke, things get broke, I'll never forget that. I was like, no, you don't ask them to pay for it, and so it helps you to get because if you just have your stuff and in your house and nobody can touch, you're really not giving it to the Lord. It's really not being used for God. It's really materialism, and you're not keeping your mind on eternal things. Because if that family with that little boy who broke that toy got encouraged or got refreshed or got saved because of that meal, that was more important than a toy. And it really helps your children to have a heart for ministering to others. Whenever we have company, I always tell my kids set the table. My girls help serve if it's adults and we need to talk. My girls will help take their kids and play with them. And so it really your home needs to be open so you guys can minister together, and your kids need to see that they're not always the most important, and what I want to eat and what I'm going to do, and I'm going to go play my video game after dinner. No. We're having company. Company comes first. Company comes first. And honestly, the last thing is God commands it. God wants you to be hospitable and open your home to others. Romans 12:13. Distributing to the necessity of the saints, given to hospitality. So I have seen both extremes in my life as a minister's wife. I have seen people in churches make the preacher, uncomfortable with too much praise and royal type treatment. But I've also seen the opposite, where the preacher's treated horribly. And the Bible teaches, though, that we're supposed to take care of the man of God that teaches you the word. And I'm not just saying this because my husband's a pastor. I'm just saying I've seen it. I've seen it growing up. I've seen where the pastor's not treated as he should be, as biblically. And Galatians 6:6 says, let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. And how many preachers I believe would still be in the ministry. How many preachers' kids would still be in the ministry if we took care of the preacher. Even Paul in Philippians 2:30 talks about Epaphroditus almost dying because the church wouldn't help. So we did something what's called deputation, and just if you don't know what deputation is, we were, my husband and I, after Bible school, he said, we're going to go to Bolivia, South America as missionaries. Well, to do that, we have to go around to churches. I don't know, we have missionaries come in, but I would say we have half and half. Some are what's called doing deputation, raising money to get on the field. Some are on furlough, right? And they're coming back to tell you what they've been doing. But deputation is where we literally packed up a minivan with a baby, and then I got pregnant. So I was also pregnant on deputation. We traveled the country. I think we went to 20-some states, or maybe more than that. And we just traveled the country, and we went to churches that would open up their doors to us. And so we saw a lot of things. And and it was hard sometimes, and it was great sometimes, but I'm thankful for the experience because I think it's made me who I am today. And I'll be honest with you, deputation's hard, and a lot of missionary wives really struggle, and it's hard, especially on young kids and families. But when we went over to the field, there was other missionaries there that didn't raise support like that, and they were struggling financially. And we weren't, because the Lord helped us raise the money we needed. It took us 2.5 years. My husband listening to this is probably going to correct all my little details, because he's like, no, we did it in 18 months. Maybe we did. I can't remember. 18 months, 2 years, It was a long time ago. And we had the support coming in. So what it really allows is when you're there on the mission field, you're not like, how do I pay to live here? You get focused on the ministry, and that's what we did. And I saw these other families that not only did they have the cultural shock and the language barriers and everything they were dealing with, they had no money coming in. And I was like, I looked at my husband and I said, thank you for deputation. And he was like, oh, I can't believe you just thanked me for that, because it was hard. I mean, I had a little baby, and then I had another baby on the road. We were literally on the road. And there was sickness, and we gained a ton of weight because we stopped at Starbucks all the time. And we didn't have GPS, so everything, we'd print out maps where we went. We stayed in roach motels. He would drive all night long, and we'd sleep in the back. So it was fun. Not really, no. Anyways, so I have a lot of stories about going to different churches and how they treat people. And I'll tell you the good story first. So the one really good one was we're sitting there and we get these letters from this church in Ohio that we're going, and it says, please tell us everything you need. And it had a list, like pages of stuff, like, do you need socks? Do you need this? And I was like, I have never in my life, like, ever received a letter like this. So we nonchalantly filled it out because we were like, is this really real? You know, and so we put just a couple things we needed, ministry-wise and just personal things. We get to this church, and I am telling you, we've never been treated so well. Like, we walk in, and when I know you were pregnant, I was pregnant with Bella, and she starts giving me clothes. I mean, bags of beautiful clothes. They were hers, but they were beautiful. I got sick while I was there, and the pastor made an appointment for me to go to the doctor and helped us get to the doctor and sat in the waiting room while I was in the doctor's office. And then they just treat us so well. They take us to the football museum and some kind of other museum up in Ohio, and it was so neat. We had field trips every day, nice dinners. They treated us so well. And then we get to the banquet at the end. Well, that paper we should have filled out with as much as we wanted, and we only put a couple things. Everybody got what they wanted on that list. In fact, some people asked for generators for going overseas. They bought generators. They bought everything on that list you got. And we were like, oh, we should have filled that list out better. But we've never had that. And I mean, we've never had that. But then we had churches like put us on a floor, you know, and we were sleeping on the floor once, or one time they put us in an RV that had no insulation. It was dead winter, and she had a major cough. We had that. We also had one where the shower wasn't working, and my husband, who doesn't fix a thing, had to try and fix the shower so we could even have a shower for church. Oh, it was bad, and they gave us leftovers. You know, like literally my husband shot this deer, and we might have a little bit of food left. Okay, thank you. You know, and so those instances, it made it harder for us to minister because we're scrambling. My husband's scrambling. She's sick. You know, we don't know how to get a shower, and then he's got to get up and preach. You know, so because of these stories, I would say the Ohio one was definitely that's not normal, and I've never forgotten that story. But because of the stories, we always wanted to have a home where people could come and just feel restful, where they could have just get encouraged and refreshed before they went on. And we want to treat missionaries well because they are doing a work that is very difficult and very hard. And so we always have opened up our home to people and when we lived in Tennessee, we were right on that main interstate, so everybody stopped. And not so much in Colorado, but in Tennessee, everybody stopped to visit us. And one time we had a family staying with us, and then a friend called, and they're like, hey, we're on our way. We have a trailer. It was the Strausses. And they have like 2 kids, and the family staying with us had 4, and we had a 1,000-square-foot, 3-bedroom, really tiny house, ranch-style house. And so we had people sleeping in on the couches. We had people everywhere. And I've never we just always opened up. And those were the sweetest times. I actually have a video of us all gathering around the living room singing hymns. And it was a beautiful time. And I'm so glad I didn't say, nope, we're too full. Now, when we have people in our house, now we have a guest room. But when we didn't have a guest room, we always gave company our best. So they would get our room. And Ada and I would sleep on the girls' bunk beds at times. We slept wherever we had to. If I had a preacher coming in, they got our room. I always gave people our best. And I remember sleeping on those bunk beds. It wasn't very fun, but it was worth it to us, So, anyways, but I would give you a heed of warning as well, though. Be careful who you just let into your home as well, right? Like we always opened up our home to people that we knew love the Lord, follow the Lord, And we had a great time of fellowship. Those are probably the sweetest times we've ever had, is just having people in our homes. And we've had people in our homes before that I was like, oh, I wish I knew them better before we invited them over, and I don't mean I meant that they stayed with us. No one here, obviously. So you do need to be careful, though, because the doors are there for a reason, right? You do have valuable merchandise in your home, and you do need to care for it. So just having anybody over is not good either. Let people in your home that aren't going to hurt you spiritually, but that are going to help you spiritually, and that you can help and minister to spiritually. When it comes to lost people, you're there to give them the gospel, and that's it. But if you know that they've rejected the Lord and they have the worldly influence, like Pastor preached about on Sunday, then you don't want that in your home, and you need to keep it out of your home. Now, let's go back to the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31:20. She stretches out her hand to the poor, yea, she reaches forth her hands to the needy. So we see that the virtuous woman, her extension of her reach is to those who are poor and needy. Because the virtuous woman has the right perspective, she cares for the merchandise in her home. She can go above and beyond and help and serve others. And she shows that we can also do the same thing. So we need to be in the spiritual activity of stretching forth and reaching out. And this, we will model the Savior who gave all and spared nothing for us. And I love this verse. Isaiah 25:4 says, "For thou hast been a strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in his distress, a refuge from the storm, a shadow from the heat, when the blast of the terrible ones is as a storm against the wall." That's what the Lord is to us. Now, the virtuous woman checks to see if there's anything she needs to add or make more comfortable in her home, or have it run more efficiently. Like I talked about, when we have people in our home, when we're preparing for company, I have a set of things we do, but I always love to clean, but I also love to light candles. And I can't tell you how many times friends that have stayed over at my house, now at their home, they're like, I never realized how much candles make a difference. And they started lighting candles in their home. I always like to put on lamps. My girls know we turn on the lamps, we light the candles. And I probably talked about this before. I do it because I know my husband loves it, and I want him to be able to come home from work and feel like he has a refuge and a home that's comfortable to come to. But I also do that for company, and it's not for accolades. It's not because I want people to be like, oh, yay, you lit candles. I want them to feel at home. I want them to feel homey, and to be a blessing to others. And my mom kind of instilled that in me when I was younger. We didn't have a lot of company. My mom worked so much, and then she would come home, and she was so tired she'd sleep most nights. So we didn't have a lot of company in our home. But my dad always worked on everybody's car because he was a mechanic. So we always had people over for that. And I'll never forget Mrs. Haas, she's going to be here next week. Mrs. Haas and her 2 grandsons are coming for a visit. And she was over at my house, and I had to have been maybe 16. And my friend, who's Korean, had just taught me how to make fried rice. And I could see Mrs. Haas just sitting and I was like, I'm going to offer her some fried rice. And so I just remembered, would you like some fried rice? I just learned how to make it. And she was like, sure. Because I could tell it was dinner time. My mom didn't know they were coming. We had nothing prepared. So I sit over there and make fried rice while I heard my mom talk. And I just remember at a young age, just, at 16, I guess it's not young, but now it is, thinking, can I offer you something? You know what I mean? This is my home, is your home. And so I never forget, though, I burnt the bottom, and I was so embarrassed because I was like, oh, this is my pastor's wife, and I just burnt the bottom. And she was like, oh, it's fine. And she ate it. So you got to tell her that the fried rice story. I don't even know if she remembers it, but she'll be here next week. But I just remember that being an impression on me. When the times my mom did have company, she always tried to make them feel welcome. And you know what Elisha says in verse 13? Behold, thou hast been careful for us with all this care. He notices how much care. She didn't just say, here's some bread, there's a room if you want it. She was very caring about taking care of the man of God. And what do you care about? Because God has given us as women the responsibility to observe what's going in our home, and to be faithful with the things that he has given us, our family, our friends, our church, and we are to be faithful with that. The virtuous woman's thoughts we've learned through the lessons is that her heart is in her home and her head is there. Hence, whatever she puts her hands to do is a quality job well done. She doesn't just give it, a little bit of effort. She gives it her all. And there's no apathy there. Just like the woman of Shunem, she gave her best to the man of God. She didn't just give him a bed. She gave him a candle and a desk and some furnishings and things that he would need. And let me ask you, would you want the preacher in your home? Is your home a place that God can use to minister and serve others? Now, because of that, we're going to talk about her promise. So let's finish verse 13. And he said, "Behold, thou hast been careful for us with all this care. What is to be done for thee? Wouldest thou be spoken for to the king or to the captain of the host?" And she answered, "I dwell among my own people." So her promise. Now, because of all that she had done, the man of God wanted to do something for her. I don't believe she wanted something done. I believe he just saw how much care she had given, and he said, do you want me to speak to the king? Is there something you would want? And what does she say? "I dwell among my own people," which really was to say, I have what I need. I'm good. I have what I need. Here she was pretty much handed a blank check, and she says, I'm fine. But then Gehazi notices in verse 14, the next verse, and he says, "What then is to be done for her?" And Gehazi answered, "Verily, she hath no child, and her husband is old." Gehazi mentions the fact that she doesn't have a son, but we see that was a big deal back then. That was who was going to take her land going. Having a son was a very big deal, but we see that it was not to her. She was given the opportunity to ask for what she needed, and she doesn't ask for anything. So she's not pining away that she's childish, because you know why? She's been a giver. She's been a nurturer. Even though she had no children, she put into her life into others. She was making a home for her husband, a nest. She was serving others, and there's no evidence that you can read of that she was like, I've never had a son, where she got bitter or distraught about her condition. And one commentator said about this, how few are there like this woman on earth, who is so contented with what she has not to desire more. So imagine someone came to you and said, what would you like, right? Write your own ticket. You can have whatever you would like. Would you have this like, okay, God, here it is. This is my list. Or would you say, I've got what I need. I have enough. But they noticed that a son would be a great blessing to them. And so he promises her son. And then in verse 17, we read, and the woman conceived and bare a son. So a year later, in a year's time, she had a son. Now, I think when she started ministering to him, she had no way of knowing that she was going to get anything out of this, right? She was just doing it because of her love for God and for her love of the man of God. She gave a lot, but she didn't give to get. But this was amazing. This was probably the last thing in the world this woman thought. He's going to give me a son. I mean, she was pretty old, I would think. He, obviously, the husband was old, as it mentions. She had no children, and Jewish women were very eager to bear children because that was the blessing of God in their life. But here's a woman who was past the point of hoping she could ever have a child, but then God fulfilled the longings of her heart. Hebrews 6:10 says, "For God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which ye have showed toward his name, in that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister." God will not forget, and he will reward you. And that's what happened with this great woman. Now, so here we have this kind, generous woman. She served the Lord and opened her home to the man of God. She invested in his life. And now, after years of infertility, God gives her a miracle, a gift from God. And there was probably great joy and fullness in this woman's house. And you think, wow, great, and a story. But no, quickly right after that, her joy turns into sorrow. If you go down to verse 19 and 20, "And he said unto his father, the boy, my head, and he said to a lad, carry him to his mother. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon, and then he died." I love how it says, carry him to his mother. In this present time, you'll see that she really did lose the joy of her life. And then she thinks about the future. If if she even stops to think about that for a moment, she has no hope in the future, right? Humanly speaking, because death is final, and now she doesn't have a son to carry on the family name and to help her as she gets weary in her old age. I don't know if those were the thoughts going through her head, because really it talks about how she was silent, and then faith whispered, and you know what she remembered? This child was a result of a miracle. This child was a gift from God. This child could be only explained in terms of God. And so if God could give her a child after years of barrenness, somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that God could give her child back. So what does she do in verse 21? And I'm going to kind of skim through the verses, but you guys can go back and read them later. She lays the boy, I think this is interesting, where? On Elijah's bed, on the chamber that she had dedicated to the Lord, that she had given to the Lord. She doesn't put her son, which you would think he'd be more comfortable. I know he has passed away, but in his own bed, she takes him to the bed on the chamber that they built for Elijah, and on Elijah's bed, and then she takes action. She doesn't fall apart. She doesn't have a meltdown. In fact, she exhibits really good self-control. And in this crisis, I think here's a woman who displays a lot of wisdom and grace, which, by the way, won't happen if you can't have that without a crisis. You won't have that during a crisis. So have wisdom and grace before. And here's a woman who learned contentment, who had learned grace, who had learned generosity, who had learned to listen to the man of God. And now when there was this crisis moment in her life, a big trial, she knew where to go. She knew what to do. It doesn't mean that she wasn't crying. It doesn't mean that she was not grieving or sad, but it doesn't strip the wisdom and grace from her. Self-possession is that state of mind in which, though a person cannot hinder his feelings, you can govern them. I tell the girls all the time this quote, feelings are indicators. They'll tell you something's going on, right? I'm sad, there's a reason, but they're not dictators. They don't make you behave a certain way. You have a choice in the matter. But we know she was grieving because it talks about her soul was vexed. There was probably great sorrow. And when she goes to see the man of God, her husband says, why would you go? It's not new moon nor Sabbath in verse 23. And she said this, which I love, it shall be well. She already had faith before she even went to the man of God to ask him to help her son that has died. It shall be well. So she asks her husband to get a donkey ready, right? And she goes to find the man of God. And I think that's really important to note that she knows where to go in a time of trouble. She knows to go to the man of God, because that was we have prophecy here, but then they had just the man of God. We have the Bible we get to go to, and she knew where to go. There was probably a few hours that she had to ride to get to him, but it shows her perception because she knows where she's headed. She knows that Elijah is the man of God who listens to God and who speaks the word of God. She doesn't know what's going to happen, but she knows she has to get to him. And that's what you do. When there's a crisis and a trial in your life, you go to God. That's where you turn. You don't ultimately turn to your husband or your best friend. You don't turn to social media. You turn to God. By going to Elijah's house, that's what she was doing. She was turning to God in the crisis because she found that God was always there in every season of her life when she was barren, and now that her son is dead. And now she is on the worst day of her life, and she goes to God. She must have heard, though, I'm guessing, the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 17, the widow of Zarephath, where you heard about the story where God miraculously intervened and provided flour and oil for them to survive the famine. But then what happens? That woman's son becomes sick and died. And surely she heard that story because Elijah brought that child back to life. And she thought, that's where I need to go. He is Elisha. He's got the same power from God. He gave me this child. He can bring him back. Surely the Shunammite woman heard that story, because those things just don't happen every day. She knew the power of God to give life, and she had experienced it herself with the gift of the son. And she knew about the power of God to overcome death. And a man said, in this faith, she makes no preparation for the burial of her dead child, but for his resurrection. She didn't say, okay, honey, let's start planning the funeral. Let's tell all the family. No, she lays him on Elijah's bed and she goes, I got to go see Elijah and I got to go see him now. And 2 Kings 4:27. And when she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to thrust her away, and the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is vexed within her, and the Lord hath hid it from me, and hath not told me. So we already know that she knew she needed to go to the preacher, right? And what does she do as soon as she sees him? She throws herself down at his feet in humility and respect. And then in the next chapter, you'll see, and then we see that what does she do? She bypasses Gehazi, and you're going to see that as we keep going. And I want to say, if you read the next chapter in 2 Kings chapter 5, which we can't go to tonight, but you're going to see that Gehazi is not really has the qualities like Elisha does in becoming in the man of God. We see he's a man who doesn't have the same kind of compassion that Elisha does. You're going to see that he's motivated more by personal gain, and he doesn't have a servant's heart. And I think she knew that, and that's why she went right past Gehazi, and she went straight for Elijah. Then she tells him, my child is dead. And in verse 30, what does she do? Elijah sends Gehazi on with his staff, and she says, I won't leave you. She stays by Elijah's side. And then in verse 32 and 34, I love how Elijah prays, and he lays upon the child. And what does he do? He pretty much lays completely on the child and puts his face on his face, and it's like he's giving life back to the child, right? And sometimes in the ministry and helping others, you're going to feel like, I'm giving my whole life to this because that's what God wants you to do. And that's the only way you can reach and help others. And that's what he saw. And then verse 35, he returned and walked in the house to and fro and went up and stretched himself upon him again. And the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opens his eyes. Finally, the child comes back to life. It's a miracle. And then in verse 36 and 37, what does he do? He summons Gehazi and says, call the Shunammite back in. And I'm paraphrasing. And she came into the room. And what is the first thing she does? She falls back on her face in front of the man of God in gratitude, in worship, and thankfulness. I would think I would just grab my child, right? I mean, like if I saw my child die and then live, I would have been like, come here. Oh, my word. But no, she goes straight to the man. She falls at his feet in the beginning. She falls at the feet at the end. And I just love that her first order of business was to just thank him for giving her child back. Because of her faith, her child lived. And when we're trying to help others, maybe it's our children that have gone astray, maybe it's loved ones, we have to know where to go. She knew where to go to get the help she needed. She knew where to go to get the right kind of help. There's so many other things out there that blind us to think this is the way to get help, this is the way to get help. But we know the only help we can get is from the Word of God, and that's the only thing that can give life back to those people that need it. And that's what happened. In Hebrews 11:35, in the faith chapter, it says, women receive their dead raised to life again. And that was her story. All right, but her story is not over. Her protection. I know we're going long tonight. I'm sorry. 2 Kings 8:1 and 2. Then spake, and that was her proving. I don't know if I told you that. And if you need the points later, I have them here. And then her protection. 2 Kings 8:1 and 2, because her story is not over, and I love this ending. Then spake Elijah unto the woman whose son he had restored to life. And she, from then on, she was the great woman of Shunem, and then she ends up she's referred to as the woman whose son was restored back to life. What a testimony, right? I mean, this amazing miracle happens to you, and everybody knows you because of it, and I think that's amazing. And I think it's like, there's Lacey, the woman that the Lord raised back to life and gave a new life to. I didn't get saved till I was in my teen years, and I remember one of the ladies that I really looked up to in my church, she goes, you are so different, and it's just such a blessing. And I said, I'm a new creature in Christ, and it's neat, right? And I want people to look at me. There's Lacey, she was dead in trespasses and sins, but the Lord brought her back to life. I mean, what a testimony. And that was her testimony. And he says, arise and go to thine household and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn. For the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall also come upon the land 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. So we know that God was sending a famine, which, shocker, they're in apostasy, they're not living right. The famine was going to come. It was going to be here for 7 years. And it seems like she is now a widow. Her husband is not mentioned. And Elijah says, okay, now you got to leave everything you have and go somewhere for 7 years. And here is a woman who does what? She listens to what the man of God says. And that sounds simple. But you have to think, she's had this home for how many years? She's lived there. It was a nice house, now with an addition, more property value. And here she was wealthy, and it was probably one of the nicest houses in the neighborhood. I mean, what would happen if she just left her house for 7 years, which we'll see? She had roots in that place. Moving to another country wasn't easy, especially back then. But what does she do? She trusts and obeys the man of God. And so she survived 7 years in the Philistines, in the land of the Philistines, while famine is going on in Israel. And then she returns to Israel with her son and finds that she has lost everything. So she goes and asks to get back what has been hers. And I'm going to make this pretty quick, but in verse 3, you'll see that. And she went forth to cry unto the king for her house and for her land. And so it happened that Gehazi was just right there to tell her story, right? And what does he say? Oh, my Lord, O king, this is the woman and this is her son who Elijah restored to life. Again, what a testimony, and what a neat thing, and what, providential timing that Gehazi just happened to be there when she was asking for her home back. I believe this woman shows a lot of confidence, right? Confidence in the Lord, confidence in the man of God. She listened to him, and because of that, God provided care for her during a really, really hard time during a famine. All right, and the last point is her profiting. And so look down at verse 6. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed unto her a certain officer, saying, restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field since the day that she left the land, even until now. So, does she get her house back? Yes. She gets her house back, she gets her land back, but she also gets 7 years back pay. I mean, that's got to be nice. She didn't do anything, and then she gets 7 years back pay for the harvest she lost. So here was a woman who was wealthy. She used her wealth, what she had, to bless others, and now what happens? In a time of need, it comes back to her. God gives back to her to make sure that her needs will be met in the time of need, that she has been an instrument and a blessing to others. Now, sometimes you might feel like you've lost ground because you're serving the Lord and you're doing a lot because of all your giving and that you're obeying God. But the king, right, in the end, will give you a reward. She followed the Lord, what the man of God told her, and years later the king gives her land back with profit for the years she lost. So, 2 Kings 5:10, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. So there's going to be a time where we're going to be standing before the king, and we're going to be at the judgment seat of Christ in the end. And are we going to have profit like she did when she received her land back? What will the king give you for your service for him? At the end of your story, will you have a profit or a loss for the kingdom of God, for what you gave to God, for the things that he gave you, right? He gave her that home, but she gave it back to him. He gave her that son. And so what will you have for the things that God gave you? God gave you more than just a home. He's given you time, abilities. He's given you talents, things that you can use for him. And he's given you your home. And so is your home being used for the Lord like the great woman of Shunem has? All right, let's close in prayer, and then we'll go over the questions. Lord, thank you so much again.